Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Swami. We're continuing with our conversations about the gurus of self-realization. We've been talking about Master Paramhansa Yogananda for more than a week, and I don't know, there's no end in sight, so we'll just keep going until we're done. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune our hearts and minds to your vibration of divine awareness, that we may live in this world in constant remembrance that we are your children, guided and blessed, protected, served always by your uplifting, wise counsel. Help us to act in accordance with your presence within, that we may cooperate with your grace. Om. Peace. Amen. The last time I spoke, I mentioned that I was going to speak about something that's in Lightbearer, the book I've written about Swami Kriyananda, which I always recommend. I was going to talk about 1982. I mean, not about the year, about something that happened in 1982. You can find it in the book. It's pure coincidence, but in 1982, Swami went to Los Angeles to give programs about something or another. And he had met about something or another. It's probably not obscure. I don't really know what the motivation was, but he went. He would go to Los Angeles periodically to give programs. And at that time, he'd made a friendship with an author named John Ball, who was a mystery writer, fiction mystery writer. In the Heat of the Night was his greatest success. He became interested in our path, and his wife became interested. And Swami did a satsang at their house, and it's the subject of the satsang, not the location, that really matters. Among other things that Swami talked about, he talked about how Master's teaching uniquely reflected the American consciousness in certain ways. And I was thinking about that satsang, which is what I want to talk about, and about how a master comes to serve a particular time, a particular place, and a particular group of disciples. And earlier in this conversation, I talked about how Master came to America, spent almost his entire life in America. He left India when he saw a vision of faces that he thought to be American. So there was some kind of a longing that came out of the American soil, a longing among a group of his people who had chosen to incarnate in America for the sake of this Dwapara Yuga evolution that the whole world is caught in. So I'm sort of running this reflection from all the different angles. And earlier on I'd mentioned, but it's an important context here, is that because of where Dwapara Yuga is going, and I've spent a long time talking about the founding principles of the United States and how perfectly designed they are to be the cradle of self-realization for the new age. So there are other aspects of the USA temperament that also match self-realization, and Master tailored his message to meet it. So when Swami, in that satsang, he talked about three elements of the American character. One is practicality. The second is cooperation. And the third, which he said is not unique to America, but is characteristic of America, is attunement with nature, which is all. It's very interesting, all of them. So I'm just going to start with the first one. We'll see how far we get. He said that Master came in response to the longing of the heart of the people who live here to not merely have a theoretical relationship with God, but something that they could use every day and that had a practical I can do something about this aspect to it. Those of us who are not schooled in religious history and don't sort of stand back and watch the flow of great ideas over time, as Swami Kriyananda did, and what little I know about it, I know it about it from him. We tend to just take things as they come. And the practical reality of Americans is something, of course, that I've grown up with, and I didn't, again, understand it until I traveled outside of it. And I'll just give you a little example. I've traveled in India and done taught self-realization in India. And especially when I first started, I was much more used to American audiences, and there would be a rapport that I would have with almost everyone who asked me a question in a class that I was in, which there would be this desire to understand a point. I would do my best to explain it. I would then say something like, "Is that clear?" And then the person would sort of clarify if there was some part they didn't get. But it would always be, we'd have a specific objective. We got to understand it. We solved the problem. We've gone forward. And that's just the way we move. I would go to India, and I really got myself in terrible trouble a few times there, because what I found as a national characteristic there, which is less true now among the millennial generation, because the millennials, I think, on all sides of the planet have been this sort of like, they just all kind of went into this big lottery, this big thing of ping pong balls. And it's like, you go to India, you go to Europe, you go to America. It's like the cultural temperament is being washed away. But nonetheless, I still found this. I would go and they would ask a question, and then I would make the mistake of saying, "Is that clear to you?" And then what would happen is it would just be an opportunity to keep the conversation going. And the more like theoretical it was, the more it was related to what Lord Rama did as reported in the Ramayana, and this unique distinction about Hanuman, which was really more like this than like this. And I just would get sucked down these rabbit holes. I couldn't get out of. The first few times it happened, it was terrifying because I couldn't get the question to stop. It would just keep going and keep going, because asking the question was really what the point was, to just sort of talk about these fascinating, yes, philosophical things. But I took so for granted that the intention was practical, that I was shocked to be in a context where practical was really not very important at all. Now, I'm not casting aspersions. There's greatness on all sides of these things. But Americans are very, very practical. And that's one of the reasons why we get things done and why we're so boring to some other countries, and why our sense of aesthetics sometimes it really lags far behind. Because if it simply works, that's all that we're interested in. So Master took, and some purists really question whether Master had the right to do this. You know, there's conspiracy theories in every school. So there's a very conspiracy theory that those of us who are part of Ananda don't pay a lot of attention to. But the conspiracy theory is that Master changed Kriya. And some purists go back to Lahiri. You have to go all the way back to Lahiri because Master changed Kriya. Swami's comment was, well, if he did, he had a right to. And Swamiji, who traces these things down to the end, he never takes anything for granted. And he was able to verify certain small changes that Master did make, but they were simply to make it more accessible and more simple, because that's what was needed here. They didn't change the essence of the teaching. But but Master took this huge, huge body of ancient lore and this huge body of Hinduism laid over the top of it. And he just plucked out this, and he plucked out this, and he plucked out this, and he made this, relatively speaking, tiny little picture that had simply the essence of what a person needed to do. And that was Kriya. And he divided it into simple steps. He created energization. He actually at one point told the receptionist at Mount Washington to teach energization, Hong Sau, and the Om technique to anyone who walked in the door. And one of the people to whom he said this protested, but don't they have to read the lessons? Don't they need to know these other things? Master said, give them experience and then they will want everything else. And so again, that was just a response. Of course, that wasn't what ended up being the policy either with SRF when Master was there or with Ananda at this point. We make it accessible, but with a little bit more requirement of people, but not much. Anybody who has a modicum of sincerity has access to the whole of the teaching, because we want people to have it, and it's very experiential oriented, and it's very it's very scientific. I mentioned this earlier, proved by experiment. It's not that we're lost in these grand theories. It's that watch the breath, see what happens. Listen to the Om, see what happens. Do these 12 minutes of exercises, see what happens. And it's all focused toward a very practical result. And that's a big change. It's not esoteric, it's not hidden, it's not you have to qualify in all these different ways. And Master himself commented, I may have already said this, that he said in India, I did say this, but I'll repeat it here. He said in India, where they've been familiar with these teachings for generations, they recognize that realizing God is a challenge. And there's a strong inclination to say, well, my karma, a few lifetimes from now, maybe. Americans, he said, knowing nothing at all about any of this, just say, sure, we can do it. Master would joke about you drive by in the morning an empty lot, and you drive by in the afternoon and a building is up. And Master said he loved that spirit. He loved that spirit about this country, is that people would just look at something and figure, I can do this. So Master presented self-realization as something that we could do. Swami actually had a very interesting reflection at the very end of his life, because he was always at odds with the ruling clique at SRF, the Dayamata, her sister, all the nuns who'd been there for a long time. And Swami was a real Walter come lately into that situation. And he just saw Master in a very different way. But Swamiji realized toward the end of his life that there was an actual sort of a basis for it, in addition to the fact that simply his mission was, his commission from Master was completely different than the commission that Master had given to that group of women. So that was part of it. But it was also, Swamiji said, Swami came in 1948. Master died in 1952, just in March, in early 1952. And some of those women had been there 20, 25 years, even longer. They had just known Master for a very long time. Swami realized that for many years of Master's life in America, he did not emphasize his own state of spiritual realization, and he de-emphasized the difference between himself and everyone he was teaching. Whereas by the time Swami got there, Swami talked about this, Master had withdrawn to a certain extent, and some of the sisters, I heard Mrinalini Mata, who was the president, who was the fourth president after Dayamata of SRF, and she talked about, now I believe I have this correctly, and sometimes the details might be a little mistaken, but I have the essence here. I believe she said it was after the samadhi that he had in 1948, which was in August of 1948. Swami came in September of 1948. That Master's attitude and energy shifted. And I believe this was presented sort of in the context as if something that he himself had become something he wasn't before. And that was, and I forgive me if I've garbled that a little bit, but that's how I remember the whole thing. In that samadhi of August 1948, which was 3 days, in which Master had conversations with Dayamata, and he was both voices. And in Durga Mata's book, she talks about how they sat up day and night with him and wrote down everything he said. But among the things that Divine Mother said to him was, in the beginning, I sent you a few lemons, meaning some of the disciples were really a little tricky. But from now on, I'm sending you nothing but angels. And then Swami said that he believes he was the first one to come after that samadhi. And given the importance of Swami to Master's mission, it's just interesting. But the end point being that Swamiji said by the time he got there, Master was more expressive of what his consciousness really was. Now, I've been combining Yogananda and Kriyananda in these days, which is one of the reasons why this is taking such a long time to get through. I hope you're not impatient. But in fact, now I'm just realizing this as I say it right now. Swamiji presented himself extremely differently at the end of his life than he did at the beginning of his life. And one of the things, actually, it's the opening to this book, to Lightbearer, because it was a significant question on my part. So I started the book here like this. See if I can actually find it. Here it is. Now, can I read it? It says, I can read it. This happened in February 2011. People often ask me, I said to Swami Kriyananda, if you have changed since I first met you in 1969. My answer is no. The first moment I saw you, I thought, his consciousness has no boundary. He is limitless. You had so much work to do, though, that for a long time you kept a veil over your consciousness. It took intuition to see through it. Now your work is done, so you have removed that veil. Your consciousness has always been the same, but the way you expressed it has changed. I trust my intuition, but it is never wise to presume, so I asked, may I say that, sir? Yes, Swamiji said, because it is true. So that was my experience of Swamiji, which was in 1969. I saw him in one way, and in 2013 or 2012, 2013 was the last time I saw him, just a month before he died. He was always just the same to me, but that was not how everyone else experienced him, I found to my surprise over the years. But it wasn't that Swamiji changed. It was the way he presented himself changed. That's why I asked Swami that, because sometimes he would tell me not to say things, even if it was true, and even if he'd said it to me. In Swami Kriyananda's We Have Known Him, which Swami read every word of that book. I mean, I was in India, we sat next to each other, and he turned the pages of the manuscript. We went over it word by word. There were certain things he wouldn't let me say, such as that he was taking on karma, primarily that he was taking on karma, that his chakras were completely clear. Those were the two things he wouldn't let me say. I said them in Lightbearer because he was already passed, and I felt it was okay. But coming back to where Master was, Swamiji said that Master presented himself as not essentially different from the people that he was teaching, or his disciples, even. I mean, even though, of course, they were totally dedicated to him as disciples, I don't mean in any way to say they didn't have complete faith in him, but it was just different. So Swami always saw Master. There was never any way that he saw Master except as this overarching divine figure, this global leader who was shifting the entire direction of the world and had come to do that. But for most of Master's life, Swami said, and he thought that he just thought that was interesting, because no wonder he had such a different view of Master. He had a totally different experience of Master. But when Master was mostly doing his teaching and having thousands of people in those lecture halls, now Master did do miraculous things, but it was important for people to believe that he was just, a little different than them. All you have to do is energize every morning and you can be like me. All you have to do is just do a few kriyas and you can be like me, because it needed to be practical. It needed to be, because that's what, the world needs now. Because Dwapara is the age of the individual and the age of the individual's energy. That's one of the things. It's not the age of society. It's not the age of institutions. It's myself. In very recent times, people's religion was church in America, and it was denominational. meaning I would move to a new city. I'm a Lutheran. I would find a Lutheran church to attend. I'm a Methodist. I'd find a Methodist church to attend. Now, insofar as people do go to church, they find a place that inspires them, because the form of it, the name of it, is not really how people identify. We identify with ourselves as individuals, and that's what this age is about. Interestingly, and this is just a peripheral to this, but my friend Sudarshan, Sudarshan from Ananda Village, was sharing with me some of his just thoughts and ideas about what's happening now. And he articulated something that was exactly right, that I have experienced it, but I hadn't thought about it. What's happening in our society right now with this extreme polarization, and with the nature of our political process at this point, and with this idea of this marvelous idea called alternate facts. There's just so many ways in which nobody can depend on society anymore. The systems that we thought would be reliable, including the economy, the public schools, just like since the pandemic especially, but it's been building for a long time. We can't rely on the world around us. Of course, we never could. It's just that it's become very dramatic, and it's very traumatic. I myself have experienced it, not not on the level of traumatic, like it's breaking my mind, but it's pressuring my mind. The complete insecurity that we're working with has actually done exactly what it should do, which is it has made the issue of my life my consciousness. That, of course, I want to use that wonderful phrase, duh. Of course, that's always been true, but you coast. You coast, because things are predictable, things are reliable. If I feel a little icky, I'll just go out and have breakfast at Joni's. I'll just read my novel and sit among strangers and let somebody else cook for me. And that was, when I would have a problem of consciousness, I would just go to Joni's for breakfast instead. And then just the other morning, it was time to go to Joni's for breakfast. But I'm in a very strict quarantine and I'm not allowed. And it wasn't trauma, but it was really interesting. It was really interesting to watch it. So Master came at a time, it was just beginning to shift, but the Master's view is a very, very, very long rhythm, where it really needs to be in the hand of the individual. So Master, and he still does, he still does, meaning all his teachings, it's like, it's right there. It's like you can do it. The effect of Autobiography of a Yogi on my generation, the 60s and the 70s, as Swami Kriyananda put it, he said, Master gave you the impression that you could just walk to India and you could stand on a street corner and you could spread your arms out and some guru would touch you on the heart and bingo, that would be that for you. Master, even in Autobiography, he totally downplayed his own role in all the experiences that happened to him, which is one of the reasons that Swami wrote The Path, and he wrote the biography of Yogananda also, because Master's own autobiography basically leaves him out of the story, which is why many people read that book and will go to India, and Swami has lamented that many people who read that book don't understand that it's Master himself that they're seeking, because of the way Master presents himself. But he didn't for a long time. And you still read. You read in Master's writings. He talks about how you can, by your own power, you can heal yourself, you can lose weight, you can gain weight, you can regenerate a severed limb, Master tells us, which is a pretty impressive thing. He speaks of it as if it was all accessible to us right now, and you can do it. And the American spirit, because of who we are, we pick that up and we believe it. To a fault, because the other thing Master brought was discipleship and receptivity, but there was a corrective needed here. So Master came to America and what he taught was practical. Because also in the Festival of Light, the way Swami puts it poetically, a prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. And the prayer of love goes up. Swamiji writes this in the little pamphlet called A New Dispensation, which I think you can find here and there on the internet if you search for it. And in the New Dispensation, Swami says, he's just talking about this line of gurus, every so often enough people pray with enough intensity that the Divine Spirit responds. And so America was founded on religious principles, but our spirituality did not match our temperament. It was too institution oriented and not practical. Because see, Americans had to be practical. When they came to this country, there was nothing. The Native Americans had a way of living on this land, but it did not match the European temperament. So when the settlers came over from Europe, they couldn't see what the Native Americans were doing as an option for them. They brought with them the picture of what they'd had in Europe, so they had to start creating something here that was more what they wanted. And there was nothing. There was nothing to create it from, just forests and rivers. And so they couldn't, theory didn't make any difference. They had to not starve. They had to not freeze to death. They just had to find a practical way to live on this land, to make a living, to protect their children. And so that just became part of the way we looked at things. The theories didn't matter. It was just a question of whether it would work or not. That's all that what's coming in my head, and I'm just going to say it here. There was this reality television show that actually one of the main characters was the cousin of one of the people who lived in this community. So I myself don't ever see these things, but because it was her cousin, she wanted us all to watch it, so we watched it. It was a survival where they took people back 100 years. They put them out on the plains of Montana or someplace like that. I think it was Montana. They put them out in the early spring, and they had to make sure that when fall came, they would survive. And everything had to be authentic, and you were allowed to bring one authentic item in with you. And it was interesting because the cousin of the friend had grown up on a hippie commune up in Mendocino. And so he was really used to primitive living, and he really did super well. And this one family that came was a very wealthy family from Los Angeles, a husband and wife and 2 girls, and they had their little cabin and so on. And then in the fall, the judges decided who would live and who would die over the winter, depending on how many peaches they'd canned or whatever they did. So everybody brought one authentic item in, and this man from Los Angeles brought a whiskey still. And he did not do real well canning peaches and drying venison or whatever else he was supposed to do. And there was this other super type A lady who had everything all just exactly so. And so he was not so clear like that, and so he didn't win. But he argued with the judges. He said, I had a whiskey still. He said, I could have traded whiskey for everything. We would have been just fine. And I actually think he was telling the truth, because he was practical. I mean, I just loved it. It was so American. It was, I will figure out a way to do this. And it's not necessarily the way you guys think it has to be done. You know, I was just out having fun with my family when you all were slaving away canning your peaches. He said, but I have the whiskey still. I know human nature. That's what it's about. No, that is not a very uplifting note on which to end this talk. But it's a very true and illustrative story. So we will continue with Yogananda tomorrow, because we have 2 more American characteristics to deal with. God bless you.